profound peace of the medieval night was a deceptively luxurious illusion. Outside the thick walls of the cloister, the world slept under a blanket of deep oblivion. But inside these hallowed spaces, slumber was treated not as a necessity, but as a transgression. Here, within the cool geometry of stone and shadow, discipline had its most exquisite tool, time itself. The monks, the nuns, pious scholars, they maintained schedules so rigid they bordered on the mathematical impossibility. The all-night vigil was not merely an extended period of prayer. It was a meticulously constructed performance piece designed for total physical exhaustion. It demanded sustained wakefulness, turning devotion into an industrial process of continuous vigilance. Imagine the rhythm, midnight striking, and the liturgical chants begin, soft at first, building with measured intensity. The candles gutter, spitting shadows that dance across faces, etched by deep focus and growing fatigue. Hours melt away in a hypnotic wash of Latin recitations and repetitive psalms. This was not merely spiritual devotion. It was an optimized system for mental weariness. The body, the simple biological machine, requires periodic disconnection from consciousness to repair itself, to consolidate memories, to simply reset its weary neural pathways. But here, that natural function was deemed a weakness, a surrender to the flesh that contradicted the purity of the spirit. The institutional mandate declared that true piety necessitated the willful forfeiture of rest. The first effect is subtle, almost imperceptible. It begins with the thinning of concentration. Simple tasks, reading sacred texts, maintaining complex chant harmonies, keeping silent watch over the dormitory, become monumental feats of will. The sustained effort required to remain acutely alert for hours on end acts as a gradual but relentless metabolic drain. The mind starts making shortcuts, stitching together fragmented thoughts, replacing genuine wakefulness with rhythmic compulsion. As the pre-dawn hours approach, exhaustion becomes a palpable presence, thick in the cold stone air, smelling faintly of stale incense and overused tallow. Sleep deprivation warps perception. Shadows stretch into monstrous shapes. Whispered secrets seem to echo from empty niches. The comforting drone of the prayers occasionally loses its coherence, fraying at the edges. The system masters this breakdown beautifully. It provides a structure so robustly predictable that the individual's internal sense of time and self-worth becomes utterly dependent on the rhythm externalized by the institution. If the chant slows, if the pace falters for even a breath, it is an aberration, a personal failure to maintain the required devotion. This manufactured sleeplessness achieved two profound objectives. First, it established physical control. A body too tired to resist, too weary to question, was a compliant vessel. Second, and more profoundly, it eroded cognitive resilience. It taught adherence that sustained discomfort, even if artificial or self-imposed, was simply the proper state of being, a prerequisite for approaching divine favor. The all-night vigil thus became far more than a religious observance. It was an endurance test, a demonstration not just of faith, but of sheer, systematic biological refusal to yield. By systematically denying the deepest human need, the restorative balm of true sleep, the Church refined its greatest behavioral tool, manufactured fatigue. It created cohorts of minds primed to accept authority, mistaking chronic exhaustion for spiritual progress and compliance for grace. The vigil was the blueprint. The resulting depleted mind would become receptive to all other protocols in the grand architecture of belief. Every space served a purpose, a spiritual mechanism. Few places encapsulated this brutal efficiency quite like the confessional booth. It was not merely a structure for absolution. It was an exquisitely engineered chamber designed for sensory minimalism and psychological surrender. Step inside, and the outside world evaporates. The heavy wood walls absorb sound, creating a pocket of profound, oppressive silence. This was not peace, it was absence. The confessional strips away all distractions. There are no visible comforts, only darkness punctuated by slivers of candlelight that never quite reach the corners. The act itself, confession, demands intimacy and truth-telling. 2 acts inherently destabilizing to the ego. And when these primal needs are confined within a space designed for utter auditory control, they become acute tools of psychological leverage. Think of it as a controlled vacuum. To enter is to submit not just your sins, but your attention. Your focus must narrow entirely onto the barrier separating you from judgment, or perhaps salvation. The architecture enforces triangulation. You speak into the void, and the priest listens through the wooden partition, his presence only implied by the faint echo of his voice and the disciplined cadence of his questions. The overwhelming sensory deprivation is key to its effectiveness. No visual clutter remains to distract. No physical noise interrupts the flow. You are left with nothing but your own breathing, the rasp of wool on wood, and the resonant weight of words that have the power to dismantle a lifetime of practiced silence. The enforced quiet becomes an active participant in the procedure. It is not merely the lack of sound, but the asterisk quality asterisk of the silence, a heavy, judgmental quietude that seems to amplify every internal tremor of guilt. The priest's role within this sterile environment was rarely purely pastoral. He became a master facilitator of manufactured vulnerability. By regulating the flow of questioning and maintaining an unbroken silence when you pause in distress, he created moments where the penitent could not re-establish mental equilibrium. Every hesitation, every mumbled admission echoed back into the confined space, magnifying self-doubt until it felt like objective truth. The system exploited a fundamental human desire, the need to be heard and forgiven. But in this dark wood cocoon, that desire was systematically harvested. The confessional did not offer mere absolution, it demanded maximum emotional output. It turned confession into an intensive performance of self-disintegration. You were compelled to recite your sins, not just for God, but for the man behind the screen, creating a complex dance of spiritual and social submission. The process was designed to leave the individual emotionally raw, a psychic state that required more than simple penance. It necessitated an exhausting level of vulnerability that fundamentally shifted their dependence away from personal resilience and toward the institutional authority presiding over the booth itself. They left not merely lighter in sin, but professionally exhausted on the emotional plane. This manufactured fatigue was the true prize, and this method dovetailed perfectly with the state of general physical depletion achieved through continuous vigil or scheduled fasting. If a person's body is running on fumes from sleepless nights and malnutrition, their emotional defenses are porous, thin as old parchment. The confession booth merely provided the final pressure point. The combination was devastating. First, exhaustion renders the will pliable. Second, sensory deprivation dismantles the narrative self. And third, the forced recitation of sin transfers ownership of one's deepest secrets to the institutional keeper. The result was a beautifully optimized subject, one who had been systematically stripped down, physically and spiritually depleted, yet simultaneously convinced that survival and peace could only be achieved through absolute acceptance of the system's authority. The confessional booth was thus not a place of grace, but a highly sophisticated psychological processing plant, refining flawed individuals into compliant devotees, ready for whatever form of behavioral modification awaited them next. If the vigil established exhaustion as a spiritual currency, then fasting perfected it. Hunger was not simply abstinence. It was a metabolic downgrade, a highly controlled deprivation designed to strip away physical resilience until the body was rendered utterly dependent upon institutional ritual for mere comfort and energy. In the cloistered world of medieval piety, the discipline of diet became another masterful behavioral modification protocol. Rules were precise, often arbitrary, demanding periods of strict fasts that varied wildly by season, penitence, or specific holy day. To deny the body its natural fuel was to create a profound vulnerability, shifting the focus of survival from self-care to compliance with the dictates of the religious structure. It was a systematic power play disguised as devotion. The stomach grew accustomed to scarcity. The mind began to equate physical depletion not with suffering, but with righteousness itself. This sustained nutritional stress did more than thin the body. It systematically dulled the edges of self-determination. A person who consistently operates on near starvation levels finds their baseline for normalcy dramatically lowered. Self-worth becomes intrinsically tied to one's ability to endure discomfort, a manufactured psychological reality cemented by endless sermons and mandatory periods of weakness. The gradual reduction of intake created a profound physiological need that the church structure was uniquely positioned to govern. When you remove the variable of adequate nutrition, every subsequent routine, the mandated prayers, the required vigils, the emotional draining of confession, is experienced against a backdrop of physical fragility. The body screams for sustenance, and when that cry is continuously framed by spiritual directives, the mind learns a devastating equation. Suffering from hunger equals proximity to grace. We are talking about making the internal engine unreliable. The discipline taught was not merely patience, it was metabolic obedience. It conditioned the supplicant, whether a novice monk or a penitent layperson, to believe that their greatest strength came not from nourishment, but from intentional, ritualized weakness. This forced compliance extended beyond simple dietary laws. Certain religious orders developed highly specialized diets tailored to specific ranks of commitment. The lower one's status, and thus, theoretically, the higher one's spiritual devotion, the more extreme and restrictive the meal regime became. The result was a population finely attuned to institutional authority, not just through belief, but through chemistry. Hunger impairs cognitive function. It narrows focus, heightens suggestibility, and fundamentally disrupts the complex relationship between physical need and free will. The physical state of being hungry is inherently exhausting, amplifying the already profound mental fatigue induced by sleeplessness and ritualized vulnerability. The combination was a perfect storm, the mind reeling from lack of sleep, forced into sensory vacuum, and the body operating on reserve power reserves. This systematic deprivation did not just prepare people for hardship, it made them exist in an altered state of physical dependency. They became creatures who measured their daily success by how little they felt guilty for having eaten, or how successfully they could fast through another arduous week of prescribed suffering. Their internal rhythms, their hunger cycles, and their need for relief were hijacked and rescheduled according to the liturgical calendar. The fasting machine was thus a powerful preprocessor for further control. It ensured that when the community moved into more intensive behavioral protocols, such as the confession or the protracted interrogation, the individuals would arrive already running on empty. They possessed no stored physiological resilience to cushion the blow of sustained emotional assault. Their internal resources were intentionally depleted through the sheer physical difficulty of maintaining life within highly restrictive boundaries. In essence, starvation and voluntary caloric restriction transformed a community into an obedient biomass. The physical body became simply another mechanism for enacting spiritual discipline, a machine capable of running on barely nothing, driven by the promise of salvation and the terror of divine displeasure. It is this state of chemically induced weakness, coupled with emotional overextension, that made the medieval subject profoundly susceptible to systems of systematic power abuse. It was a biological prerequisite for obedience. The cumulative weight of these protocols, the wakeful vigil, the starved gut, the raw emotional vulnerability in the confessional, left the subject depleted on reserves that were not purely their own. They had been systematically dismantled through deprivation. Each day a careful, calculated erosion of self-trust and physical resilience. But depletion was only half the equation. The true architecture of control lay in the routine itself, the hypnotic, relentless motion that further eroded the mind's executive function. This is the trap of repetition. It is the endless ritual. Consider the act of prayer, not merely utterance, but embodied action. The repetitive swinging of a rosary, the rhythmic movement of hands during contemplation, the forced kneeling until the very tendons ache. These were not simply acts of piety. They were sophisticated neurological tools. The human mind craves pattern recognition and variation. It seeks endpoints, novelty, or disruption to break its focus. When faced with an unrelenting, monotonous rhythm, a constant, predictable motion paired with hours of cognitive exhaustion, the brain begins a profound process of adaptation. It starts filtering out the noise, the movement, until it merely becomes background static. The mind enters a state we might call hyperfocus on the simple present, where complex thought falters and suggestion takes root. The repetition itself became the mechanism for compliance. Each bead recited, each prayer repeated, was a gentle sandpapering of independent thought. It created a cognitive overload through routine. One's attention, already fragmented by lack of sleep and hunger, becomes hyper-attuned to external structure, the hand guiding the beads, the required posture, the rhythmic cadence set by the collective. The subject is physically exhausted, but more crucially, their mental energy has been redirected into managing the ritual itself. Their capacity for deviation shrinks. Where once they might have held a distinct philosophical objection or remembered a personal history unsuited to confessional acceptance, now the entire processing power of their consciousness is devoted merely to maintaining the sequence. They become excellent at being predictable. The institutional rhythm thus achieves two devastating goals. First, it ensures that any burgeoning thought, any flash of resistance or self-assertion, is immediately overwhelmed and drowned out by the sheer volume and predictability of the prescribed motions. The mind gets tired of thinking. It simply settles into moving. Second, and perhaps more subtly sinisterly, this relentless routine creates a profound dependency on the external structure for internal grounding. When reality is reduced to the sweep of a bead or the mandatory dip of a knee, the self begins to lose its perceived boundaries. The individual starts equating peace with predictability, meaning with repetition. They become accustomed to receiving certainty from an outside authority, the rhythm keeper, the guide, the priest, even if that certainty was fundamentally hollow. This is cognitive control via motion. It does not require pain in the visceral sense, nor does it demand confession of mortal sin. It only requires time, structure, and the simple, relentless insistence on continuity. The steady, predictable motion acts as a psychological anesthetic, wearing down the sharp edges of individuality until all that remains is the soft, compliant hum of unquestioning participation. It turns inner life into an external performance, policed by beads and set by chanting. The trap is not merely the exhaustion, it is the insidious realization that the only state of relative calm they have achieved is one dictated entirely by the hands of others. This structured inertia laid the groundwork for every subsequent disciplinary action, turning the simple act of prayer into a sophisticated behavioral modification protocol, systematically ensuring that when the deepest psychological pressures arrived, when hunger, sleeplessness, and accusation were layered on top, the individual was already too tired to remember how to think for themselves. The body had done its work, but it was the mind, softened by endless rhythm, that proved to be their ultimate undoing. The church had perfected the subtle arts of control long before it ever devised a rack or a stake. The physical brutality of overt torture, while horrifying in its own right, was merely the loud punctuation mark following a far more insidious preamble: engineered exhaustion. To understand how institutional power truly operates, we must look past the spectacle of pain and examine the systematic undermining of basic human needs. We are talking about sleep. In medieval society, sleep was not simply biological. It was viewed through a theological lens as either blessed respite or sinful laziness, a surrender to carnal weakness. The church skillfully commodified this concept. If devotion meant constant wakefulness, then the simple act of rest became tantamount to spiritual dereliction. The institutional power structure thus established its first great psychological weapon: mandated sleep debt. This was not accidental, it was structural. Every liturgical calendar, every holy day, presented a built-in schedule for depletion. Consider periods like Lent or major festival cycles. These were times when the required level of piety demanded an accelerated timetable of wakefulness, vigils that stretched through the night, prayer schedules that overlapped with natural circadian rhythms, and fasts that compounded both physical and mental strain. The result was a predictable, culturally sanctioned exhaustion. By the time a person reached their spiritual apex, the annual pilgrimage, the climactic confession, or the most critical interrogation, they were already running on a deficit of hours, a metabolic debt enforced by community expectation. This collective fatigue transformed what might have been a choice into something that felt like a divine mandate. You didn't decide to be tired. The sacred rhythm asterisk required asterisk it. The exhaustion was not just physical, resulting in heavy eyelids or slower motor skills. Its power lay in its psychological ripple effect. A sleep-deprived mind is hypersuggestible. Concentration wavers, memories become unreliable, and critical judgment softens at the edges. The internal narrative, the person's sense of self and reality, begins to fray under the constant strain of lack of rest. This made them exquisitely vulnerable to structured psychological pressure. When you are perpetually tired, your ability to sustain skepticism diminishes rapidly. You begin to accept external rhythms as being inherently true, merely because they represent stability in a world that feels alarmingly unstable. This concept formed what we can call the liturgical sleep debt, an accumulated deficit of rest woven into the very fabric of religious life. It was the systemic application of biological science for spiritual ends. Fasting emptied the body's reserves. Continuous prayer kept the mind racing, but fundamentally unrested, and mandated vigils ensured that the recovery period never quite caught up to the demand cycle. The subject entered these controlled, ritualistic environments: the confessional, the council room, the interrogation chamber, already metabolically weakened, existing in a permanent state of mild systemic stress. They were primed for compliance. The debility was therefore not merely incidental, it was foundational. It established a low baseline of physical and mental endurance that the church could exploit repeatedly. The goal was to reach a point where resistance seemed disproportionately costly compared to simple agreement. To endure another sleepless night, another day of deprivation, meant conceding certainties, accepting institutional definitions of sin or truth simply because maintaining intellectual resistance felt too heavy for an already exhausted mind. Imagine the ritualistic choreography. The weeks begin with systematic depletion, the forced vigils, and escalating fasting build the deficit. Then, the subject enters the confessional booth, a dark room, amplifying a pre-existing vulnerability. Here, stripped of sleep and nourishment, the enforced silence does not simply prompt confession. It allows the authority figure to guide the mind through a haze of suggestion until the penitent is too exhausted to argue with their own emotional collapse. Or consider the repetitive, monotonous motions described earlier: the circling, the chanting, the rhythmic dipping of beads. When combined with acute sleep deprivation, these rituals become profoundly effective tools of cognitive attrition. They do not just tire the body, they overwhelm the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, judgment, and independent critical thought. The mind becomes receptive to patterns imposed from the outside. This confluence, the physical depletion from fasting, the emotional collapse in a sensory vacuum, and the systemic undermining of sleep, created a perfect storm of compliance. The individual had been gradually engineered into a state where their primary internal resource was diminishing so rapidly that they became utterly dependent on external structures for cognitive regulation. Their reality model was outsourced to the institutional authority. The power inherent in this process was its invisibility. No one needed whips or chains initially, only a calendar and a mandatory bedtime schedule, meticulously managed over generations. It redefined weakness not as moral failing, but as an inevitable consequence of adherence to divine law. To be tired was to be pious. To question the established order was to defy the rhythm of sacred life itself. And in that shared exhaustion, compliance became less a matter of fear and more a surrender to the powerful, inescapable gravitational pull of tradition and ritual. The Church had mastered the art of cyclical power abuse. Build up expectation through structured discipline, then deplete the physical and mental reserves over time, reaching a saturation point where voluntary action is functionally impossible without succumbing to exhaustion. This deep understanding of human biological and psychological limits, the knowing that when we are profoundly tired, our best defense mechanisms fail, is perhaps the most chilling realization of all. It reveals that some of history's greatest abuses were not fueled by sudden malice, but by a cold, calculated mastery of our most fundamental vulnerabilities. Our need for rest, structure, and ultimately peace. For centuries, we have studied the subtle exhaustion wrought by scheduled prayer and engineered vulnerability. We learned that fatigue was not merely a byproduct of devotion. It was a controllable resource, a predictable weakness to be managed and harvested. But what happens when the methods move beyond emotional depletion and into the brutally physical? When spiritual discipline crosses the threshold into mere torture, this chapter confronts us with the full spectrum of formalized suffering, escalating our examination from the exhaustion of the mind to the sheer limit of the body. The systems we analyzed before, the all-night vigils, the fasting regimes, the repetitive confessionals, were protocols of denial. They systematically denied rest and comfort. But in certain periods, particularly when heresy or perceived sacrilege was suspected, mere psychological exhaustion proved insufficient. The authorities required a complete breakdown, not just of spirit, but of physical narrative coherence. Here we enter the era of the ordeal, where deprivation reached its most extreme and formalized articulation. Water, chains, and orchestrated panic. The purpose here, as always, must be viewed through the lens of control. The devices and techniques themselves, the rack, the slow application of pain, the withdrawal until near collapse, were less about extracting information than they were about dismantling the subject's very ability to construct a coherent self-narrative under duress. Pain was not punitive alone. It was meticulously leveraged for behavioral modification. The body in these contexts ceased to be an autonomous agent and became merely a repository of symptoms, the twitching muscles, the ragged breath, the tremor that betrayed fear. Torture, viewed academically, becomes an advanced form of psychological breaking. It is the removal of all external anchors, reliable comfort, consistent sleep, predictable pain, and ultimately, reliable reality. The subject was forced into a state of total sensory dissolution. Imagine the water, administered not in sudden bursts of agony, but gradually, systematically. A persistent, creeping dampness that defies the body's natural rhythms. It is an unending cycle that simulates crisis without allowing relief, the wet curtain refusing to lift completely. This engineered panic thrives on anticipation. The subject lives perpetually 1 minute away from full submersion, a constant flirtation with drowning that keeps the mind trapped in hyper-alert terror, incapable of settling into the necessary exhaustion for recovery. The chains are equally instructive. They do not simply restrain movement, they restrict potential narrative action. A man chained to a wall is fundamentally limited in his capacity to protest, to run, even to gather himself against an unseen force. The metal becomes a symbol of imposed stasis, forcing the consciousness inward where it can be most effectively interrogated and destabilized by authorities who sought not facts, but compliance. When we synthesize these elements, the profound sleep debt maintained across weeks of vigil, the metabolic weakness from enforced fasting, the emotional raw nerve exposed in the confessional, and combine them with orchestrated physical trauma, the result is a subject floating at the precipice of psychological collapse. The individual who enters this state is not merely sick or injured. They are narratively bankrupt. The breaking point is reached when the internal monologue ceases to follow linear logic, when memory becomes unreliable, when pain desensitizes itself into a generalized hum, and when the fundamental understanding of self, who I am, what happened yesterday, why this is happening, fractures under sustained stress. The authorities were masterful at exploiting this cognitive collapse. Their objective was not merely confession. It was forcing a surrender to external interpretive authority. The sheer physical ordeal forces the mind into a place of manufactured panic where the most powerful psychological tool is misinformation. Details are altered, timelines are warped, and simple truths are deemed impossible because the subject has been repeatedly shown that nothing they believe about their own reality can be trusted. They become malleable narratives waiting to be edited by those who hold the pen. This rigorous dismantling of personal truth established an unparalleled level of institutional power. It created a permanent class of dependents, individuals whose sense of self-worth, stability, and very existence was conditional upon maintaining favor with and adhering to the pronouncements of the ecclesiastical authority. The subject learns that their survival, their peace, even their physical integrity, rests solely in adopting the institution's version of reality. This is a brutal study in systemic power abuse, dressed up as spiritual hygiene. It refines our understanding of control by showing its transition from scheduled deprivation into managed catastrophe. We see how every element, from the rhythmic tapping of prayer beads to the calculated agony of an immobilized body, and finally, the simulated terror of water and chain, builds toward one single psychological endpoint: absolute compliance born out of utter exhaustion. The lessons learned from these extreme protocols are sobering. They demonstrate that when basic biological needs like sleep and comfort are treated as forfeitable privileges, and when physical pain is formalized into a curriculum for obedience, the individual does not fight freedom. They negotiate its surrender simply to stop the relentless pressure. The architecture of power was thus perfected, built on an endless cycle. Exhaust first, then question everything until nothing remains but assent. The techniques we have cataloged thus far: the unending vigil, the sterile quiet of confession, the gnawing emptiness of systemic fasting, and the repetitive drain of ritualistic prayer, all built a single, devastating architecture. They created a culture where weakness was not just tolerated, but actively desired and enforced. The body became predictable, the mind malleable. But institutional power understands that mere exhaustion is insufficient. A tired subject can still argue, still resist with memory, and more dangerously, might cling to an illusion of self-worth. Therefore, the process had to become infinitely circular. It had to evolve from physical attrition into pure psychological depletion. This brought us to the machinery of the Inquisition, not as a spectacle of raw violence alone, but as a finely tuned engine for dismantling the very scaffolding of identity. Doubt. Doubt was their true spiritual currency, and it required an endless spiral. The interrogation itself ceased to be a quest for truth. It became a methodical process of crafting confusion, using uncertainty as fuel. Imagine the prisoner, already frayed from months of mandated sleep debt, whose physical reserves are depleted by ritualized suffering. Their initial testimony, however flawed, possesses the anchor of their own remembered reality. That self-narrative is precious to them, and it must be systematically pulverized. The learned interrogator did not seek a confession, they sought collapse. They were masters of controlled ambiguity. When questioned about heresies or betrayals, the focus was never on proving guilt. The physical evidence often provided that enough. but on ensuring the subject could no longer distinguish between what was truly known and what had been suggested by the weight of institutional authority. The questioning became a rhetorical gauntlet where every answer prompted an orthogonal line of inquiry, dragging the accused deeper into contradictory threads. It wasn't about finding one definitive statement. It was about exhausting the mental energy required to maintain any consistent thread at all. The process was a deliberate, escalating performance art of intellectual torment. If a subject claimed ignorance of certain writings or affiliations, they would be immediately confronted not just with alternative evidence, but with endless variations on that evidence. These questions were designed to create a dizzying sense of partial truth, a moment where the prisoner thought they had exited one snare, only to find themselves trapped in a subtly different, yet equally impenetrable, web. The objective was psychological whiplash, alternating between searing accusation and seemingly benevolent counsel, between moments of brutal interrogation and sudden reassurances of potential mercy, provided compliance was achieved. This juxtaposition was the most insidious weapon of all. It taught the subject that stability, even freedom from questioning, remained contingent upon their confession. To resist was to re-engage with pain. To cooperate was to achieve a temporary cessation of that pain, thereby conditioning them for future submission. Furthermore, the authority structure itself became part of the torture protocol. The accused was forced into an academic role, the historian, the theologian, the expert in their own sin. They were required not only to admit guilt, but to recite the theological reasons why that guilt was inevitable or understandable under specific circumstances. They had to meticulously piece together a narrative of decay, where personal failure seamlessly merged with cosmic inevitability. This added a layer of intellectual exhaustion rarely seen before. It forced them to use their highest cognitive functions, memory, articulation, structured reasoning, in service of the persecutor's goals. The mind becomes its own cage when it is tasked with self-incrimination in such detail. The interrogator operated not as an inquisitor, but as a deeply manipulative academic guide, leading the subject through a manufactured spiral of doubt. They would present conflicting authorities, a genuine piece of evidence juxtaposed against a fabricated one, two seemingly reliable testimonies that contradicted each other, or a theological dictum presented alongside a pastoral contradiction. The sheer volume and contradictory nature of this information was designed to trigger cognitive overload, forcing the subject's internal system into a perpetual state of unresolved anxiety. The question was never, "Are you guilty?" but rather, "Which version of reality are you going to survive with?" The cumulative effect of these techniques, the sleepless nights, the starvation, the forced performance of belief, was to strip away not only secrets, but the basic capacity for self-trust. The prisoners ceased trusting their own memory, their own reasoning, and finally, their own moral certainty. They lived in a vacuum created by endless questioning when doubt was systematically fueled until it became chronic. The mind, desperate for equilibrium, would find the easiest path to stability. And that path invariably led to agreement, to recantation, to an acceptance of a narrative provided from without. This wasn't merely breaking a spirit, it was reprogramming consent. It taught them that only by sacrificing their own intellectual autonomy could they achieve a fragile form of psychological peace. Thus, the interrogation spiral proved that the Church's most potent weapon was not the rack or the flame, but sophisticated ambiguity. It demonstrated that the perfect control mechanism requires not absolute physical devastation, but the profound, crippling certainty that your own mind, the place where you believed freedom resided, is fundamentally untrustworthy. The ultimate surrender, therefore, was not to force, but to the seductive promise of closure, offered by an overwhelming torrent of confusion and exhausted hope. The previous stages of spiritual discipline had systematically dismantled the body and mind. Through perpetual vigil, through enforced starvation, and within the cold echo chamber of confession, we learned that exhaustion was not merely a side effect of piety. It was the foundational currency of control. But even a spirit rendered compliant by fatigue can still possess a fierce, unpredictable core. When the systems designed to break men fail, they often pivot to managing the aftermath, attempting to channel the sheer voltage of existential panic into manageable forms of compliance. This brings us to rituals presented as cures, the spectacular moments where ultimate anxiety was not met with theology, but with dramatic performance, the supposed exorcism. These were environments designed for emotional breaking point, places where the victim's own sanity could be made public property and subsequently catalogued by the institution. The Church authorities did not simply seek truth, they sought stable subjecthood, a manageable soul capable of resuming its productive, deferential existence. To analyze these supposed cures, we must first understand the prerequisite state of the individual. These individuals entered these rituals already depleted. They had endured the relentless scrutiny of the confessional, stripping away their secret's peace by agonizing peace. They had been kneaded by the repetitive motions of endless prayer, exhausting their cognitive elasticity. And most significantly, they were walking skeletons of sleep debt, where the boundary between subjective reality and institutional mandate had already dissolved. Their resilience was not natural. It was systematically engineered to be fragile. When such a subject is then subjected to ritualized hysteria, a dramatic outpouring of perceived possession or spiritual distress, the spectacle becomes the final, fatal mechanism of submission. The performance of madness is mistaken for divine intervention, and that mistake is the system's ultimate triumph. By validating an external source of disorder, the institution reinforces its own centralized authority as the sole interpreter of chaos. Consider the dynamics of a true possession narrative from a historical perspective. They are never random. They are choreographed narratives requiring maximum emotional energy expenditure. The victim must expend every last remaining joule of willpower simply to exist within the framework of the ritual. They become living canvases upon which institutional fear and authority are projected. Every scream, every shuddering rejection of reality is not an act of pure spiritual combat, but a performance dictated by profound fatigue and heightened suggestibility. The purpose here was astonishingly pragmatic. It was behavior modification at its most theatrical level. If you cannot control the spirit, you manage the symptom. The ritual demanded that the subject's emotional breakdown be contained within accepted religious parameters, a demonic force requiring exorcism rather than an internal mental crisis requiring medical intervention or autonomy. The participants in these cures were left in a state of profound psychological vacuum. They had been told their minds were invaded. They had suffered physical exhaustion designed to degrade normal neurological function. And then, by the end of the ceremony, they were granted absolution not from sin, but from madness. This final step is the masterpiece of control. The promise that merely surviving the ritual was proof of continued acceptance within the social and spiritual order. The institution did not heal them back to a state of natural equilibrium. It reset them to a compliant, dependent baseline. They emerged understanding that their deepest distress could only be resolved through the mediated authority of the Church's power structure. The sheer exhaustion inherent in sustained hysteria meant that fighting the system became simply too tiresome. It forced the subject to conflate internal disorder with external spiritual threat. Instead of realizing they needed genuine rest, stable environments, and psychological safety, the basic building blocks of human resilience, they learned to anticipate the next cycle of emotional turmoil, knowing precisely which authority figure held the key to its supposed termination. The trauma itself becomes the mechanism of compliance. This dynamic is far more insidious than mere interrogation by threat. Interrogation required truth. These cures required only a performance. And the body, perpetually denied sleep and starved for cognitive rest, eventually yields not secrets but narratives, a narrative of submission that claims ownership over the very definition of sanity. If previous chapters established physical weakness as a prerequisite for spiritual acceptance, this chapter reveals the final frontier, demonstrating that voluntary hysteria is simply another form of surrender. The subject trades autonomy for perceived relief. They accept the authority's diagnosis, accepts the authority's ritual, and most critically, they accept the authority's definition of what constitutes mental stability itself. The historical record reveals repeated cycles of this phenomenon. When a community became anxious, be it fear of plague, political change, or societal breakdown, the ecclesiastical response was often to amplify that anxiety until a sufficient group of individuals reached a state of emotional and physical collapse. This vacuum allowed the pronouncements of powerful clerics to fill not just spiritual blanks, but genuine cognitive ones. The ultimate byproduct of these forced rituals was not salvation. It was systemic normalization. By framing profound psychological distress as evidence of external demonic interference, the Church successfully localized any internal questioning, any dissent about the system itself, and painted it with the brushstrokes of madness or damnation. The only safe path lay in full acceptance of the established order. The process is thus a brutal feedback loop. Depletion leads to hysteria. Hysteria requires ritual management. Ritual management reinforces dependency. And dependency ensures that when the next crisis arrives, the subject will be conditioned to surrender their personal reality for the sake of promised systemic relief. The cure was never the spiritual grace they claimed to provide, but the absolute, undeniable resignation of the afflicted spirit. The smoke clears, the tallow candles gutter out, and we are violently wrenched across the centuries. We leave the echoing stone chambers of confessional booths and the damp chill of medieval dungeons behind us, but the protocols, the architecture of exhaustion, they never truly retired. We find ourselves now in a vastly different landscape, one lit by screens rather than candlelight, where the scent of incense is replaced by the sterile tang of ambition. The mechanism for control did not die with the fall of empire. It merely updated its operating system. What we witnessed over these preceding chapters, the systemic exhaustion manufactured through mandated wakefulness, the controlled surrender achieved by emotional voiding, and physical depletion was not confined to a pre-Reformation Europe. It is a timeless playbook for behavioral modification. The rituals of submission have simply shed their ecclesiastical garb for the shiny vestments of modern capitalism. The relentless pressure to optimize, to maximize every waking minute, mirrors the medieval demand for perpetual vigil. Where once a man was kept awake by continuous prayer and fear of eternal damnation, today he is kept awake by the siren song of productivity. Sleep has become not merely undesirable, but culturally framed as an ethical failure. To rest is, therefore, synonymous with falling behind, with spiritual bankruptcy in a material age. We are participating in our own voluntary vigils now. The modern discipline mimics the medieval ordeal on a grand scale, demanding continuous engagement and output until the nervous system screams for release. This engineered depletion of resources, the hustle culture phenomenon, is remarkably similar to the liturgical sleep debt we studied before. Instead of being deprived of rest by sacred law, we are depriving ourselves through internalized cultural mandates that equate perpetual motion with moral worth. The expectation to always be on, to check emails at midnight, to maintain a visible schedule of hyperproductivity, is simply the digital confessional booth for the modern soul. The voluntary surrender of time and energy has replaced the forced submission to the altar. Consider the self-optimization movement, the obsession with metrics, quantified living, and the tracking of every calorie burned or minute spent in deep work. This obsessive quantification of existence is a successor to the rigid structures of monastic life. It attempts to map and control the interiority of human experience through external data points, much like the meticulous record-keeping of sin in an inquisitorial court. The modern subject voluntarily undergoes its own cognitive overload through routine. The endless scrolling, the constant consumption of fleeting information across dozens of platforms, is a meticulously crafted form of distraction fatigue. It keeps the mind superficially engaged, just enough to prevent deep introspection, while ensuring that the cognitive reserves are utterly depleted by the sheer volume of input. This superficial exhaustion prevents the very stillness needed for critical thought or genuine rebellion. Where the Church utilized fasting and sleep debt to weaken the body's resilience, modern society leverages information overload and metabolic burnout. The 24-hour news cycle, the expectation of immediate response in professional life, these are all mechanisms that enforce a constant state of low-grade emergency, keeping cortisol levels elevated and the critical faculties dulled. We are metabolically downgraded by constant distraction. The ultimate aim remains identical: to maintain a population too tired, too fragmented, and too distracted to question the foundational authority structures. In the Middle Ages, the threat was hellfire. Today, the threat is professional irrelevance or social obsolescence. The power structure has merely updated its incentive mechanism. Ritualistic nature of this control is also apparent. Instead of kneeling before a painted idol, we now participate in the rituals of achievement, the relentless grind toward promotion, the pursuit of the next arbitrary benchmark of success. These routines are soothingly predictable, offering a false sense of purpose that channels anxiety into productive, if ultimately self-destructive, avenues. And when the modern individual finally breaks down, when they hit the wall after the all-nighters fueled by coffee and ambition, what is offered in place of genuine rest or true freedom? Often, it is a new protocol, another biohack regimen, a productivity course, or a subscription service promising further optimization. The cycle is closed. Failure to optimize does not lead to divine punishment. It leads to being perceived as inefficient, as suboptimal, and thus expendable. The lesson is chillingly clear. The foundational control mechanism established by mandated fatigue, the understanding that a tired mind is an agreeable mind, has proven to be remarkably durable. It crossed the gulf of centuries, discarding its ancient implements like the chain or the candle vigil for the sleek instruments of connectivity and capitalist expectation. We traded theological dogma for economic imperative, but the psychological vulnerability remains the central commodity. The deepest power structure is never one enforced by brute physical force alone. It is always one that controls our capacity to think clearly, our ability to rest fully, and ultimately, our right to boredom, that sacred space where revolutionary thought often takes root. If history teaches us anything through this brutal lens, it is this: true autonomy requires the radical acceptance of slack time. It demands a period of unquantifiable inactivity that cannot be monetized or optimized away. Because in the quiet void, when the screens dim and the metrics fail to calculate meaning, the ghost of resistance finally has room to breathe. We have followed the arc of exhaustion through centuries, observing how the powerful, refined techniques of denial, from the all-nighter vigils that stripped away physical reserves, to the meticulous void of confession, and the systematic draining enforced by ritual fasting. Every discipline we detailed was a thread in a vast tapestry of institutional control, designed not simply to persuade, but to preempt resistance entirely. By the time the accused arrived at this final stage, their reserves were dangerously low, a psychological debt accrued over years of forced wakefulness, emotional turmoil, and metabolic downgrades. They were running on an engine fueled by exhaustion, a state we termed what I now recognize as sustained compliance readiness. They had forgotten how to be simply tired. They no longer knew the deep, restorative weight of natural rest, seeing it instead as evidence of spiritual laxity or moral failure. Sleep was not merely biological necessity. It was a theological sin, an act of withdrawal from divine surveillance. The very concept of genuine sleep thus became indistinguishable from surrender. To close one's eyes was to admit that the vigilance, the ceaseless watchful state demanded by the institution, was insufficient. It suggested vulnerability, a physical reality to which the spiritual authority could not afford to concede. The ultimate goal of these sophisticated protocols, therefore, was never just confession or obedience. It was achieving an unsustainable level of chronic wakefulness. It is here that the subject reaches their breaking point. They have been sleep deprived since they were children, subjected to cyclical liturgical debts, and then pushed far past those natural boundaries by mandatory schedules of prayer and labor. Their minds are frayed wires, unable to hold a continuous narrative, susceptible to the slightest suggestion or manufactured burst of hope. But history, in its dark wisdom, always presents resistance, and that resistance rarely takes the form of fiery protest. It is far quieter, more elemental, and profoundly restful. The moment for defiance arrives not with a shout, but with the slow, reluctant closing of the eyelids. Sleep emerges as the ultimate refusal. When the subject finally succumbs to true fatigue, this state ceases to be viewed merely as a weakness that must be corrected by further discipline. Instead, it becomes a defiant assertion, a reclaiming of personal time, an undeniable claim on physical autonomy. It is saying, in the deepest silence, my body belongs to my biological rhythm, and I refuse to surrender it to your calendar. This refusal fundamentally undermines the entire operational model built upon wakefulness. If rest can be defined as an act of resistance, then the central pillar supporting institutional control, the belief that all moments must be lived under watchful spiritual scrutiny, collapses into incoherence. The system relies on maintaining a perpetual, low-grade state of emergency, where self-care is synonymous with sin, and deep rest is simply not permissible. This shift in perspective forces us to confront the core relationship between spirituality and biology. Does enlightenment require sacrifice of sleep? Or does it, in fact, require profound, restorative periods of unconscious stillness? The quiet time when critical thinking and genuine emotional processing can occur outside the glare of scrutiny. The realization that deep rest is a form of protest is perhaps the most subversive truth to emerge from studying these ancient methods. It implies that true spiritual or intellectual freedom cannot be achieved through endless ritual, forced confession, or mandatory physical agony. Instead, it whispers that autonomy resides in the simplest biological imperative, the need for natural, undisturbed sleep. The quiet refusal to participate in artificial wakefulness is a deeply powerful act of resistance. It withdraws consent from the very structure built upon exhaustion. By returning to the golden slumber, the subject reclaims their internal landscape. They are not redeemed by grace, they are restored by biology. And this restoration, this natural return to baseline rest, remains the most potent, overlooked form of revolution. This suggests a continuity far beyond the dusty cathedrals and torture chambers we have examined. The exhaustion protocols developed in these eras find modern echoes in everything from corporate hustle culture, which mandates perpetual productivity until burnout, to modern cycles of hyperconnection that deny true quiet time. We continue to live in a society built on perpetual wakefulness, where the metrics of success demand an engineered absence of slack time. the medieval protocols of control, while brutal in their specificity, the water torture, the forced vigil, the cyclical fasting, have only provided the blueprint. The playbook for systematic depletion, that strategy demanding the constant maintenance of a low-grade emergency, has simply updated its costuming. Sleep debt is no longer a sin requiring purgation. It is now framed as a personal failure to optimize, and the modern spiritual authority, whether institutional or corporate, demands compliance with the cycle. Work until exhaustion, and then promise only another scheduled form of temporary relief, thereby preventing the sustained reclamation of true rest. The history of these methods is not merely about how the church controlled bodies. It is about how institutions control attention. And attention, whether harvested through confession or measured by productivity metrics, is fundamentally finite. The golden slumber remains the quiet monument to what cannot be quantified, commodified, or commanded, the absolute